In the closing hours of the Battle of Perryville during the American Civil War, Confederate General Leon Polk was awakened from his slumber at night to the sound of gunfire. He and his Confederate troops on the line were being shot at from across the woods. General Polk knew sort of the lay of the land and where other Confederate troops should be at that time for the next day campaign. And he believed that Confederate troops across the woods were mistakenly shooting at him and their other Confederate brigade. So General Polk, in the dead of night, got on his horse. He rode out from among his brigade and rounded the woods where the gunfire was coming. And in the darkness of light, for his benefit later, there was no moon, so illumination was extremely difficult. He came across another man on a horse. General Polk asked this man to identify himself, and he identified himself as the colonel of the Indiana Brigade. General Polk had mistakenly got on his horse and rode into the camp of Union troops. And at that moment, the colonel asked him to identify himself. Luckily for Polk, he always wore a dark cowboy cap and a dark charcoal trench coat when riding. And because there was no moon that night, he was just a silhouette on a horse. At that moment, General Polk decided he had a few choices to make. He could turn tail and run and maybe try to negate the bullets that would be coming his way, but he decided a more audacious move. He decided to play a bluff. And so he told the colonel, "I will identify myself in a few moments, Colonel, but right now I'm giving you an order to cease fire." And General Polk turned his horse into the Union troops and casually trotted between the lines, engaging the Union officers as if they were his own, talking to them, giving them the order to cease fire. Finally, after an hour or two, when he felt it was safe to abandon that camp, he rode back around the woods to his Confederate camp and told his troops that he had reconnoitered the enemy camp and they were safe to engage it. He gave them pinpoint places where all the soldiers were, and the next morning, the Confederate troops won the conclusion of the Battle of Perryville because of an audacious move by General Leon Polk. In 1 Samuel chapter 26, we have another audacious move coming from another top-notch soldier, a warrior who has never lost a battle, so in the biblical record thus far, and that is David. David is extraordinary in once again having the opportunity to kill Saul, but not doing it. And he makes a rather audacious, courageous move to engage Saul with. Now, to read this chapter in the overall context, if you've been pilgrimaging with us the last few weeks, you realize this is the third chapter in a row where David has the opportunity to kill someone that is standing in his way to get what he wants, but in each situation, he refuses to do so. This is the second time in 3 chapters that he has the opportunity to kill King Saul. In fact, he's given advice from his friends and compatriots to do so to sort of end this flight that has been going on for years. In fact, the flight of David is the last half of 1 Samuel. More material is given in 1 Samuel to David's flight than to him being a shepherd boy or a giant killer. So if you're one of David's boys, it would get tiresome not to be home on weekends, not to celebrate the holiday with your kids, being a wanted man with a bounty on your head. So when the opportunity comes to kill your enemy and to stop this, do it. But David, in an extraordinary decision, chooses not to. Now, most of us probably would, right? We're living in a day and age where we're self-centered and we don't like trials. We wouldn't like being dogged by evil men. And so if we have the opportunity to end it, we would end it quick. And this perhaps demonstrates our problem, that we want to do God's job for Him on our way, in our timetable. And David demonstrates the opposite. And he really demonstrates what is, I think, the key theme of this chapter and of this story. And that is, this story is meant to give David hope and encouragement that God will be his protector and his vindicator in his time and in his ways. The key summary verse to this, I think, is found in verse 23. If you read verse 23, I believe you have the crux of this chapter in the summary statement, particularly the first line. There, David pronounces, this is after his lengthy speech with Saul, he pronounces, "The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness." That is the line. Later, in the next verse, David is going to give two specific rewards that the Lord gives him. One is protection, and the other is, of course, vindication or preservation. So that seems to be the specific things that God is doing for the faithful. But there is the line, and there is the purpose, and there is your homework assignment. That's the application of the sermon. That's what I want you walking away with today. And that is this, that you, as a righteous man or woman of God, should trust God that He will protect you in His way, in His timing. Just like He did David. David didn't try to do God's job for him by doing the fast track of eliminating Saul, but David's testimony is he will have faith, he will trust that God will do the fighting for him, and God will be the judge, God will be his protector. And so that is our main objective. If you leave here and I haven't given you hope to trust in God, then I have failed as a pastor. So that is what I want you dining on at lunch, thinking about this evening, thinking about this week, is that you should trust the Lord your God that He will protect you. He will protect His church. He will vindicate you in His timetable, in His way, just like He did David. And I think you can take the promise of verse 23. So why even preach today? You can be dismissed now. So there's the sermon. Well, now let's go back quickly and give a summary of the story, and then I'll unpack this application in 2 points. So the story is pretty straightforward. Beginning in verse 1, we have our tattletales back on the scene, our snitches, the Ziphites. This is the second time that they've run like little weaklings and told Saul the whereabouts of David. Saul then gets 3,000 of his armed forces to track David down, so he hasn't learned his lesson. David, though, is a man growing up. Intelligence guided by experience is a wonderful thing. So it's sort of like the old cliche, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. David is not going to be fooled again. He actually has spies now spying on Saul because he doesn't trust Saul. And his spies come back and tell him where Saul is camped close to David on the hill banks of Hachilah. And Saul lays down at night. David is on a ridge where he's overlooking Saul's camping. And then a move that is quite common for that day, Saul sleeps in the middle of the camp. So imagine throwing a rock or a pebble in a pond and it ripples out. The center of that is where Saul sleeps. So to get to Saul, they didn't have planes back then. To get to Saul, you've got to go through his 3,000 troops to get to him. So they're all sleeping on the circumference of their king. We learn that Saul goes to bed at night and his pillow is his spear. He sleeps at the head of his spear, right? He jabs a spear in the ground and sleeps there. We'll come back to the significance of that. The spear is mentioned 6 times in this chapter. It is a major image used, and it's Saul's security blanket. He doesn't go anywhere without that spear, remember? And David gets this bright idea. Who will go with me into the camp of Saul tonight? Now, if you're one of his troops, you got to think, he's spent a lot of sleepless nights. He's not quite there. And who does this thing? But then Abishai, one of Joab's kin, speaks up and says, I'll volunteer to go with you. And Abishai may have thought that this was going to be sort of a ninja assassin type thing. I mean, if Jonathan did it with 2 guys, we can do it. I'll come, we'll see, we'll plunder. But when they get in the camp, the only plunder they take is a water jug and a spear. And Abishai says it'll only take once for me to pin him to the ground. And so they march through this camp and they march back out. The only thing they have to show for it is Saul's still alive. Every one of these troops are still alive. But David gets a water jug and a spear. Abishai, if he needed to confirm David's sanity, it may not have got confirmed there. We walk away with a water jug and a spear. We risk our life for this. David then gets back on the ridge and screams out to Abner, who is Saul's general and bodyguard, and it wakes them up. This is kind of humorous when we realize why they're asleep. And David wakes them up, and he has a little fun with Abner. There's a bit of a sarcastic dialogue here. He says Abner. Abner begins to wipe the sleep from his eyes. David calls out in verse 14, are you going to answer, Abner? Abner then wants identification, and David then begins with his satire, which is quite simple. Abner, for such a premier career man, you're not much of a bodyguard. In fact, not only you, but all 3,000 of you ought to be court-martialed and executed because none of you defended your king. And that is job description number 1 for an officer and soldier in the king's army, is to defend the king at all costs. Yeah, it has a little bit more rubbing, and then finally he says, David is sly here, to actually bring proof, visual proof to the debate, and says, tell me, where is the king's water jug and the spear? Well, everyone in the camp would know where the spear was. Saul couldn't sleep without it. And David holds it up as proof that he had been in that camp, and he uses that as a visual aid to go off on, once again, I could have killed King Saul, but I'm not going to touch the Lord's anointed. Then he goes off into a grander speech where he puts Saul back on the defensive and says to Saul, who, by the way, when he hears David's voice, wakes up from his slumber and does the my son David nonsense speech. David has had it up to here. All of us, when we deal with someone who does the same sin over and over against us in our life, and we've got to clean up the mess. I don't know if you've ever had someone in your life like that. I have. Where it's like the umpteenth time they do it again. At some point, you have it up to here. David clearly in this chapter has had it up to here with Saul because he does not engage Saul anymore. He doesn't care what Saul says. He's going to rant with his speech. Saul pulls out the my son card. My son, David. And David doesn't pay any attention to it. He keeps on with his speech and he says, look, Saul, let's end this right now. If I have sinned against you, and that is the reason for you dogging me, maybe it is. I mean, David asked Jonathan this earlier, right? David asks Saul, maybe God is using you to judge me for some sin I've committed. If I've committed a sin against you, let's hear it. So that right now I can make an offering for my sin, confess it, and we can be done with this nonsense. But if it's not of God, if I haven't committed a sin, then you ought to be ashamed of yourself. That you, a king, are really showing less of your dignity than you chasing after a flea. There's that image again. chasing for one partridge up a mountain. That's me. I'm worth nothing to you. And yet you're coming after me to kill me? I pray that God judges you harshly and that He will protect me and He will vindicate me. Then, of course, Saul comes back with his infamous sob story. My son David, I am wrong. You are right. I should not have done this. David pays no attention to this. It's just meaningless words. David then quotes this verse that I just quoted to you in verse 23 to affirm that the Lord is faithful to those who are faithful to Him. He will reward every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness, which for David is a testimony. God's going to protect me from you, Saul. God's going to vindicate my name by righting all the wrongs you've done against me. And they part company. And we learn here this is the last time Saul and David will ever meet. They'll never meet again. Saul goes one way, and David wisely goes the other. And they never come together again. So that's our story. Well, what is the lessons of the story? The lesson, as I just said a moment ago, is that you should trust the Lord your God to protect you and vindicate you in His time, His way. And if there is a word we need to hear in these crazy days, we need to again return to that childlike trust that our God will protect His people from anything in His will. I want you to see this, first of all, in that we should trust God. David's is vaunted for his faith. God blesses those who have faith in Him. That's exactly what David says here in verse 23, right? The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness to Him. Saul is not, David is. Now, I want to linger on this a bit, although I don't think it's the main point of the story, but it intersects our verse and our main theme. If you're like me, it is a great temptation to study, say, the life of David, the man after God's own heart, and you think to yourself, I don't know if I have a heart for God. David, the one who the Spirit of God is always on him the rest of his life, and you may think, I don't know when the last time the Spirit of the Lord was on me in this way. So it's very easy, if we're not careful, to canonize David. And I want you to see that David's faith in God was not perfect, but it was growing. That's the key. We see a development in his spirituality that we can see the last 4 chapters, or actually the last 3, and then the chapter coming up. But it's a not perfect faith, but a growing one. Let me show you first how our faith, like his, is not perfect, right? In chapter 24, David, in a remarkable act, refused to kill King Saul in the back of a cave when given the chance. That's amazing. I'm not sure I could say that. If my enemy is there, I would probably reason like my friends have reasoned. Of all the caves he walked into, you happen to be there. He's by himself. He's unguarded. God's sovereign. He did this. But David goes the opposite direction, says, no, he's the Lord's anointed. And we see remarkable faith in chapter 24. I won't touch him. I'll give him over to God. God will take care of him in His own way, in His own time. Then we have chapter 25. Well, what goes on in chapter 25? This remarkable man of faith who trusts in God to protect in all times and all ways is now willing to take up a sword and butcher a man, and not only him, but his entire household of male servants, simply because this guy, this jerk, didn't give him provisions. So in chapter 24, he won't even breathe on Saul the wrong way because he's the Lord's anointed. But in chapter 25, when he hears that a guy called him a name and stuck it to his troops, he's getting on a horseback with armed swords and 400 men to clean house. It's vacillating faith. And then we flip back to this chapter. Amazing faith again. This guy walks down into a camp with only one other guy. I mean, a twig could snap, a light sleeper could arouse, a dog could bark, but it doesn't happen. And David has the opportunity, kills King Saul, and chooses not to. In fact, makes this great speech that we just read, that the Lord blesses the faithful, and He will protect me. David spends more time in his speeches here in this chapter on God's vindication. God will judge, God will protect. But then what happens in chapter 27, verse 1? David will never meet Saul again. Now, he doesn't know this, but he will never meet Saul again. Given what he just said, that God will protect me and vindicate me from you, Saul, and may he... And then in chapter 27, verse 1, David said in his heart, I will perish one day by the hand of Saul, and so I have to run to pagan land to be safe. Where is his faith in God now? He's just told us in chapter 26 that God is going to judge Saul and God's going to protect me from Saul. But here in chapter 27, he's scared to death of Saul, that Saul's going to kill him again. So he runs to a pagan. This is not a perfect faith. This is a vacillating faith. And brothers and sisters, it's very important, particularly in the times we're living in, to realize that God uses men and women of this earth that are still very much of this earth. We're not perfect. Moses was a murderer, and God made him one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. Paul was a jihadist who slaughtered the church, and yet he becomes persecuted for the church and the cause of Christ. Peter was a denier and a liar and a racist and a bigot. Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield owned slaves. On and on we go. And here we have David, whose faith vacillates, and yet he is still a man after God's own heart. The Spirit of the Lord is still on him. So our faith is never perfect in this world, but we see a man whose faith is growing. Right? David says something in this chapter that tells me he has learned some valuable lessons. In fact, a lot of scholars struggle with comparing chapter 24 to 26, and many scholars say, well, they're really one story. They're so similar. They didn't happen twice. Saul wouldn't have done that, but I choose to think that they're separate stories. And there's a lot of similarities, both with language and sequencing and what happens in both chapter 24 and in chapter 26, with one at least slight difference. And the difference is found in a speech that David makes. And he says here in chapter 24, you'll notice the line, surely Yahweh himself will strike Saul down, or his day will come and he will die, and he will go down into battle and be swept away. There is this great restraint on David. And the restraint of David in chapter 26 was not quite as seen in chapter 24 with this language. Well, what has happened since chapter 24? Chapter 25. I think when David says what he says here about going off on there is a day coming where God will judge Saul. I know that day is coming when Saul will be judged. I think David is echoing the lessons he learned with Nabal. Remember Abigail's speech to him last week? That God's going to judge Nabal. You let him take care of it. Don't you be a man of bloodshed. And here David has the opportunity to do it. He doesn't. And he virtually uses the same line of reasoning that Abigail used on him. I say all that to say, though David's faith vacillates, It is a growing faith. He's learning his lessons in God. And so must we, right? That's really the key, is growth. Are we growing in our trust in God? Not are we perfect, but are we growing? This brings me, lastly, to the main crux of our application of what I want you to trust in. Your trust is not perfect, but it's growing. And that is to trust that your God will protect and vindicate you from all evil. He promises to do so in His way, in His timing. Now, I want to point out two images in this story that God seems to use as His means to protect David from Saul. We would probably not use these weapons, these means, but God does. The two are sleep and spear. So I want you to have that in your head. Sleep and spear. The first, the offensive weapon that God uses, is sleep. You can ask, was it David's ingenuity? Was it his bravery? Was it his audacity to go into this camp by himself, just with another guy, and do what he did? Certainly he's all of those things, but the text is quite clear of why a twig didn't snap, why a dog didn't bark, and why a light sleeper of Saul's army didn't wake up to kill David. We find it in verse 12, don't we? They didn't rouse because a deep sleep from Yahweh had fallen on them. Saul is utterly helpless. He could bring 30,000 troops, but God made them all to go to Never Never Land. And you'll find that in the Old Testament, God actually uses sleep quite often. And every time in the Old Testament when God brings sleep on someone, it always means that He is working to do something. Case in point, in the Garden of Eden, God causes Adam to sleep. And what does God do while Adam sleeps? He works. And so God comes to this camp and He causes a deep sleep to come on Saul and his army so that David, his man, could be at work. So God uses sleep as His tool to protect His anointed. The second is the spear. Now in our story, the image of spear shows up 6 times. I think this is a big deal. Saul sleeps with this spear. The historian is very clear to tell us it is at his head, so it's close. It's a security blanket. This is the spear, by the way, that he throws at David twice. This is the spear he throws at his own son Jonathan. This is the spear that he holds while he's giving his advisors and servants a firm dressing down at Gibeah. In other words, in Saul's life, how he deals with threats is by using this spear. That's his security blanket. I deal with those who threaten me with this spear. And David comes, and I don't think it's an accident, he takes the very thing away from Saul that Saul is secure with. Thus, with both sleep and with the removal of the spear, we have Saul being rendered completely and utterly ineffective to threaten David. He is a toothless tiger. He is snake without fangs. He's the heart attack without the attack, right? Saul is a puppy. He can't do anything. The Lord has done it all through these unorthodox means of sleep and the removal of a spear to once again remind David and remind us God protects His people. When the odds are against us, though evil men want us, God in His own time and in His own way protects us. And the message of the Bible in redemptive history is this. We see it in Noah's life, where Noah is against the world. And the world are laughing at Noah, they're persecuting him, and when it's all said and done, it is God who plucks Noah out, puts him in that boat, and protects him from punishment that comes in God's timing and in God's way. God does it for Israel at the Red Sea. He opens up the Red Sea, and for the first time in human history, people walk on dry land in the bottom of the Red Sea. God's holding up that Red Sea for his people who cannot fight with military weapons the superiority of the Egyptians. And once they go through the Red Sea, the Egyptians do, and God comes and protects his people with those waters, and Egypt is no more. Later on, when Israel is taken captive and they spend 70 years in captivity, the prophet Jeremiah will come along and say, you rejoice and you live in that captivity until God's timing comes, when he will protect you and vindicate you. And isn't it interesting that God uses a pagan nation to defeat another pagan nation who has held Israel captive, and that victorious pagan nation will liberate Israel. But Jeremiah tells them, you trust God, you live your life, God will protect you. And of course, in the New Testament, we see this, don't we? Most of all, we see it in our Savior, Jesus Christ. Oh, there were a lot of enemies at the cross, a lot of enemies that we have brought to the table. There was the enemy of death that certainly threatens us. I mean, one of the reasons I'm looking at you wearing masks is because you don't want to die with some virus that we're told we may die from, right? So death is a real enemy. Evil in this world that dogs us every day and is becoming much more prevalent every day, where right is wrong and wrong is right. That is a real enemy. Our internal flesh that tempts us every day is a real enemy. All of these things seek to harm the church of the living God and to you and I. And yet our God, through his Son Jesus Christ, took all of those and nailed them to the cross. And as Paul talks about the little church of Corinth, and he says that we're persecuted, yes, but we're never destroyed. We're cast down by men, yes, but we're never forsaken by God. We're always bearing in our body the death of Jesus Christ, who has given us the victory in Jesus. Come what may, church, our Lord will protect us in his way, in his time. That's what you're to go with in that great comfort. Now, I have over this year, 25 years in pastoral ministry. Throughout my pastoral career, both as an associate pastor and then now as a main preaching pastor, I've counseled a lot of people with anxiety. Some are genuine, others are made up, but it's real to them. Right? And there's a lot of things that can truly make us anxious. And I probably, if I had to think, counseled probably hundreds of people through the years that are worrywarts, that are anxious. If they didn't have something to worry, they would worry about that. I have never once in all my pastoral career ever had someone come talk to me that was anxious because the seasons would not change. You know, if we're going through winter, and this past winter, at least for me, was a long winter. It really wasn't harsh, just a long, cold winter. But I could get through the long winter because I knew someday, I didn't know what day it would be, but someday the crocus would bloom. Someday the daffodils would burst through the grass. Someday the tulips would open their bud and the robins would sing and the grass would turn green and the trees would bud out. I knew winter would be gone and spring would come. I didn't know the exact day Couldn't tell you the temperatures. Know not to trust a Midwest weatherman. I know that. But I knew I was not anxious about the coming of spring. Right now, I get in a bad mood a lot because I don't do humidity. I hate the humidity with a passion. One of the questions I'm going to ask Jesus Christ is, why did you ever give us anything over 90 degrees with humidity and then mosquitoes? That will come quick too. Why are there mosquitoes? Because if there's a few things that get me punchy and test my Christianity, it would have to be sitting outside in muggy temperatures. I hate sitting in my own sweat. I hate it. I hate it with a passion. I would rather attend an insurance lecture for a weekend with the driest speaker you could ever imagine than deal with humid temperatures. But you know what gets me through these days of algae is that the fall is coming and October will be here. And the cool breezes will come. And this is the seasons you see. No kid goes to bed tonight fearing that the sun will not come up tomorrow. Well, that same imagery is the kind of faith we must exercise with God, who always protects His children, come what may. We may not know the exact day, we may not know the exact measure, the weapon He chooses, but we absolutely know that when you and I go to Him in prayer and we pray, deliver us from evil, He's going to do just that in His time and in His way. So brothers and sisters, go and trust your good Lord God, who promises, just like He did for David, He will protect you from evil in His way, in His time. Father, I'm so thankful for this dear family, this dear family, this dear family, this dear